all those great powers are having bets in this conflict, and they would not like to lose those bets. Some of them cannot afford Russia losing, some of them cannot afford Ukraine losing, and that gives Ukraine a chance of utilizing those interests and desires into political and military support, turning them into political and military support. That also tends to make the war last longer, in my view. But it also makes it fundamental. The resolution of this war will be really important for how the future international order arrangements will be made.
Hello and welcome. Our guest this week is Professor Mykola Kapitonenko. He teaches international relations at what is often considered Ukraine's most prestigious center of learning, Taras Shevchenko University. We discuss Kyiv's relations with the various powers and regions around the world, of course with the USA and Europe, but then there is that neighbor to the east that is causing so much suffering here. We look at it not only in terms of a bigger picture, but what does it mean from the inside looking out? Where do Ukrainians see themselves within the structure of Europe or the West or, yes, the entire world? And again, there is Russia, which isn't going anywhere anytime soon. How do you live next door to somebody who has shed so much blood here? How can you be neighbors again? And we talk about the concept of sovereignty, what that means for Ukrainians, what that might mean if Moscow finds success here, but also not just for the country itself, but what would it mean for the concept of sovereignty everywhere if the Kremlin is able to change the rules of the game. It is an intricate and complex conversation, but I hope you will find it informative and educational. So, Mykola, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us today. We meet, normally we don't kind of do news cycle stuff. We do more, intense discussions, but we also have to mark a moment in time here because we're speaking in a week in which one of the worst air attacks in Kyiv happened. So many dead, so much destruction, at a time when the Trump administration says it's making progress, or it's publicly saying it's making progress in a peace process. What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, concerning the missile attack, I have just published a post on Facebook yesterday writing that from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, it was this type of scenario which was the most likely one. Because this is, unfortunately, this is not about sending signals or messages. This is just how a modern war is looking like in the 21st century. Devastated cities, damaged infrastructure, killed people, unfortunately, lots of refugees. This is the reality Ukraine is facing and is about to face, I guess, for a pretty long time. Proceeding from that, my overall assessment is that this war is tremendously difficult to end. I was always skeptical about any attempts to reach any sort of a ceasefire, to find any negotiated settlement, or generally to put this war to an end. Unfortunately, in the modern world, wars are much easier to start than to resolve in one way or another. The statistics is all against any short-term scenario of the termination of war. These wars are used to last for decades as a rule. They are not regularly, they are not ended with any formalized settlement. Rather, they can de-escalate to a certain level, but there is no guarantee that they will not re-escalate again. Given those, if you want, theoretical perspective, my assessment of Trump's efforts to find a solution to the war has always been skeptical from the very beginning. Lots of friends of mine have been more optimistic. Back in November, when Trump won the elections and promised to put an end to the war, they expected him to deliver quite soon any form of settlement. But I have always been aware that this is tremendously difficult. Now almost a year has passed since then, and I see that it is not enough leverage on the side of the United States administration. There is no zone of possible agreement for the parties to the war, for Ukraine and Russia. There is a very high political price for any compromised settlement of the war for both countries. And there is a global layer of this standoff, which is not only about the situation in bilateral relations on the front line or in Eastern Europe in general, but about the future of international order, which adds another layer to this war and makes it very difficult to end, even with the efforts, targeted efforts, by the most powerful country's administration.
What do you make of the Trump, well, not just the Trump administration, but Trump himself, clearly having some sort of admiration or kind of a good impression of Vladimir Putin, or a positive impression of Vladimir Putin, and then conversely, he seems to have a real issue with President Zelensky. What's your impression of that dynamic?
What I think is that political leaders, even if they are unaware of this fact, they perceive international politics through specific lenses. There is a way they assess the events around them and make a sense of what is happening. And what we are witnessing today is when the world is getting back on a very realist track. That is, what is happening in international politics is makes sense through the realist approach, which is very old, which is classic, and which provides a very cruel picture of international politics. In particular, focusing on the great powers playing in a different league than the rest, having more rights. Power, might, converts into political influence and converts into what states can or cannot do. There is a well-known maxim by Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian, that the strong do whatever they can while the weak have to suffer. That is a part of a realistic outlook. Mm-hmm. And that is when realism is coming back. It also brings back political leaders who tend to see international politics through a realist approach, according to realism. And Trump is one of them. The Russian leadership has been realistic for a pretty long time. And in my view, realism is an integral part of the so-called Russian school of international politics. That is how they view the world, in very realistic terms. That's why they admire power and are ready to sacrifice a lot of things to maximize their power. That's why they are regretting about the collapse of the USSR. So everything is assessed through the lenses of greatness, which is also a part of a realist paradigm. Trump also is seeing the world through the lenses of realism, meaning great powers are competing among themselves. The weak must accept what they are told to. And there is also a strong emphasis on the so-called relative gains and on the elements of hard power. That is what make Trump's framework for assessing the things he is witnessing. That is why, while seeing the decline of the American leadership, he wants to cut off security commitments. He wants to make some sort of a deal with other great powers, which are much more important for him than smaller powers.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I don't think there is something very personal in his perception of Putin. But I think there is a great deal of, let's put it, respect, because he sees him as a leader of a great country. And it is better for him, within this understanding, to strike a deal with such a leader, with such a country, rather than fight it. In particular, under current geopolitical circumstances, in which China is the major threat to the United States. And in order to compete with China, you have to reach some sort of agreement with Russia. I believe that in Trump's assessment, it would be next to impossible for the United States to outweigh both China and Russia.
You depict a world in which, as you call realpolitik, is supreme, and that the strong determine the fate of the weak, the larger determine the fate of the smaller. For the better part of the latter 20th century and up until the first period of the 21st century, the idea of might not make me right that sovereignty is important. Is the age of sovereignty done? Are we now just breaking into blocks of spheres of influence, that America gets North and South America, Beijing gets Asia, and Moscow gets some sort of dominion over Europe? Is that the world in which you're envisioning?
Yeah, that's a good question to discuss with my students, by the way. Probably I will try to remember it. In my view, the age of sovereignty arrived generally in the 17th century with the Peace of Westphalia.
Yeah.
Since then, we live in the world of sovereign states, but sovereignty has never been taken for nominal value. That is, that states do not intervene into each other's actions, politics, not try to conquer each other or extend their spheres of influence. In a way, this idea of sovereignty, that state has a supreme power in a certain territory, has gone hand in hand with large wars, with large conquerors, with the construction and dissolution of large empires, with the creation of those zones of influence. And somehow they coexisted. So I think that because of that, there will be nothing new in the world which is coming. The world of sovereign states in past 3+ centuries has seen the periods of more structured competition, when blocks and alliances have been created, when they have been standing against each other. The recent example was during the Cold War, but probably even beyond. After the Cold War was over, still there was the world in which some states are more independent and some states are less independent. In reality, not on a formal level. All of them are UN members and formally have one vote in the General Assembly. But in reality, for people like Trump or Putin, there is certainly a huge gap between the capabilities, influence, power, and interests of great powers possessing huge amount of power, whatever is considered to be a power, and smaller countries. And in that sense, the difference is not in the dissolution of sovereignty as an institute, but rather in the way it is being treated by political leaders, by diplomats, by experts, by academics. I mean, there are periods of history when sovereignty is more respected, when international law is more powerful, when generally international institutions are more functional, when states agree that there is some basic fundamental amount of freedom for all of them. And if there is something which is problematic, there are ways to agree or disagree about that, to negotiate. And there are periods in history when international institutions, regimes, organizations are failing, when egoist interests of states are surfacing, and international politics is being shaped by the combination and struggle of those interests of great powers. These are just different periods of history, I would say, and we are living in the one when institutions are getting weaker over time, and national interests are getting louder, and they are stronger in defining the future of all of the countries. And in that sense, the countries remain sovereign, but the way they perceive other countries, the way they formulate their national priorities, national interests, may differ.
Well, then let me bring it back to what's happening here. And after all the blood and all the history between Russia and Ukraine, can you foresee a time when they can be neighbors and a peaceable relationship can happen? Or again, are we doomed to be right now fighting that very question of will Ukraine be sovereign? And if sovereign, can it be a good neighbor and vice versa with Russia? Or does it have to become a Belarus?
Another good question, in my view. First of all, I think that one of the intermediate results of the war is that Ukraine is preserved as a sovereign country. The question is what would be limitations, conditions, and the shape of Ukraine in general in the future. That is still to be resolved during and after the war. But Ukraine has already proved that it has survived, and this is a huge achievement given the asymmetric nature of this war, given the disparity of power, of military strengths. This is a very good result.
So Ukraine does stay sovereign.
Right. But sovereignty is not something abstract. Sovereign states can still have different profiles of foreign policy, of their internal political arrangements, and although countries like Belarus, Finland, Austria, Germany, or West Germany during the Cold War, for instance, the United States or China are all sovereign in the formal understanding, they have different spectrum of possibilities, let's put it like this. So in my view, I believe that the issue of relations with Russia has always been fundamental to Ukraine's political future, institutions, foreign policy, security policy, etc. That was the question which was fundamental in a way that depending on how you answer that question, what is the format of relations between Ukraine and Russia? You can ask that question back in 1990s, then in 2005, for instance, in 2020 or in 2014. So at each moment this question remained the core one. Depending on how you answer that question, you will have different strategies in dealing with the United States, with the Brussels, with major European powers, with NATO, with the European Union, with your neighbors. So that, in that sense, this question has been fundamental, and it has been probably never properly addressed in Ukraine. It has been overburdened with lots of things which deviated the optimal solution, I would say. It was overburdened with political speculations, with the impact of history of the past and how the ways has been interpreted, with the propaganda of different sorts which Russia has been applying to Ukraine. With this, it has been dependent on the way Russia has been formulating its own foreign and security policy, and that was the process of evolution, which the Russian policy under Putin is very different from the one during the presidency of Yeltsin. So what I want to say is the question is really fundamental, and we now have to address it under very harsh circumstances of war. And it may seem that Russia is about to stay Ukraine's eternal historical enemy in the future.
Mm-hmm.
That is what I think most Ukrainians would agree to. That is why wars are so dangerous, not only in the sense that they produce devastations today, but because they significantly impact the future. The countries which have experienced the war in the past between themselves are much more likely to perceive each other as historic enemies in the future, and that impacts the mutual expectations. It impacts internal policies, and that leads to a certain scenario which realizes itself. The more you are talking about the war, the more likely it is becoming. So, theoretically speaking, there is also always a broad range of options. Even if you have a war currently, that does not mean that the countries would not be able to agree to some sort of stable relations in the future and have those peaceful relations. Germany and France is the most often cited example of how they have been fighting a number of wars in a very short period of time.
Well, even in a certain period of time, the British and the French.
Absolutely.
You know, that was centuries of animosity.
Absolutely. The history, if you take any two European neighbors, I think their relations will be most likely overburdened with military conflicts and violence and all sort of things. But depending on the framework into which the countries may be put, depending on the different sorts of agreements, it is possible to build more stable, more predictable, and more peaceful relations. This is difficult. And it is very difficult to assess today what kind of efforts it will take for Ukraine and Russia to be good neighbors in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It is very difficult to assess any sort of a probability.
Yeah.
I don't think that the price would be necessarily for Ukraine to become something like a Belarus. I think that could have been looking like a price for preventing the war. Actually, that's what Ukraine could have agreed to and avoid the war. But that option is gone already. Today we have already...
So do you think at some point, maybe even post-Maidan, that Ukraine would have agreed to become a kind of a vassal state like we have in Belarus?
I think that the situation has been different after 2014.
Yeah, and I pick out, not to pick out 2014, but to my mind, having been on Maidan in 2014, I think the country changed significantly after... I suspect you may have a good point between 1991 and 2014, but I think after 2014...
Certainly. After
highly
2014,
the
the price was different. And if we are talking about the price for avoiding the war, mostly that price has been inscripted in the Minsk agreements, the way Russians have been perceiving them. But what I mean is that there is always, or almost always, some sort of a format of coexistence the neighboring countries can agree to, because wars are very rare in the modern world, wars between states. And this is for a reason, because it is much more easy and much more beneficial, much more optimal,
profitable,
to reach a peaceful agreement
Yes.
on whatever terms than having a war. Obviously, there was no way Ukraine could agree to a price for staying in peace with Russians between 2014 and 2022. That price has been proved to be unacceptable for Ukrainian leadership. We can get back to times before 2014 and to speculate about whether Ukrainians have been willing or not willing to pay that kind of price and what price that could be. But in my view, this would be a very rhetorical exercise. A more general idea of mine is that no matter how difficult, violent, problematic periods in history in relations between two countries may be, it is almost always possible to make relations better in the long run, sometimes in probably decades.
Mm-hmm.
And that may take significant, huge efforts, maybe very difficult from different perspectives. But in the end, many countries have gone through those kind of difficulties, and they have reached success. I do understand that today, in the middle of the war, it is really difficult and probably impossible to imagine good neighbors of Ukraine and Russia with Ukraine having democratic perspective, EU membership, in which I believe more than in NATO membership, more or less independent foreign policy, and nevertheless enjoying peaceful relations with all its neighbors. But time flies, and political dialogue suggests a variety of opportunities to settle almost all the issues on the agenda, no matter how difficult they may seem today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've spoken about the paradigm of Kyiv's relationship with Trump's America. We've spoken now just, of course, about the future of Russian-Ukrainian relations, but there's another party here we need to speak about, and that's, of course, Kyiv's relationship with the European Union. What are your thoughts on how Kyiv and Brussels, and then, of course, Kyiv and London, can have better, or, what kind of relationship they need to have, both in the immediate term during this war, but then in longer term? What does that look like to you?
I'm convinced, at least by now, that Ukraine should join the European Union. That's not evident, and I have not always I have been convinced in that. I'm rather skeptically viewing the EU membership perspective. Have always been skeptical about that, because I do understand the logic according to which the European Union is functioning. I know the difficulties Ukraine is facing in joining the European Union, and for the most part, for recent decades, I thought that it would be impossible for Ukraine to become an EU member, regardless of the rhetorics, which was okay. But apart from that, it was just as much unrealistic as joining NATO. However, the war, in my view, has significantly changed that those strategic calculations the EU members are maybe having. The problem is that by launching the war against Ukraine, Russia has significantly shifted the pattern of threats to the European countries and to the EU. And it has created a long-term fundamental problem, which can be boiled down to the question of how much protecting Europe would cost and who's going to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very tricky and difficult question for European elites, given the stance of European economy today and in the future. In my view, the perspectives are quite gloomy, and that's why the European Union cannot rely on its normal, usual power assets like it used to decades before.
Mm.
It has to look for solutions, and it has to look for solutions which probably are not very expensive. One of them is to make a deal with Russia. And that is what I have been afraid of, and still I am afraid of, that this option may seem pretty attractive to some European politicians today, or even more European politicians tomorrow. Making a deal with Russia probably at Ukraine's expense, taking the way Trump is taking today, may be may seem appropriate to Europeans. There is no guarantee that they will not do that. But one of the elements of the price Russia is paying for this war is destroying this option. By continuing the war against Ukraine, it is undermining, it changes the perception of European elites. And because of that, this way, which has been generally taken by European countries, in particular by Germany and France, between 2014 and 2022, is becoming less likely today. However, it is still a possible scenario. If not this, then Europeans are getting back to the question who is going to pay for it. And they may arrive at some point to the conclusion, which is evident in my view, that accepting Ukraine into the European Union is a cheaper and more reliable option than providing Ukraine with weapons and money for eternity. Driven by those calculations and considerations, Europeans at some point may come to the conclusion that EU membership for Ukraine is overburdened with different sorts of problems and challenges. But it is still a better option than keeping Ukraine out and living with the necessity to continuously supply Ukraine with money and weapons. That is what was my idea back in 2022, when the initial peace talks in Istanbul have been taking place and this package of agreements have been speculated by different people. My understanding was that EU membership should be a part of this deal. No matter what other options are, Ukraine should be a member of the EU. Just because one of the core elements of Ukraine's victory, acceptable result of the war, is a sustainable economy, which will be a new model, economic model, compared to the one which existed before the war. So we will need to have a sustainable economy capable of defending itself. We will have no allies, we will have no NATO membership. We will have to pay for our security by themselves. So we need to have a sustainable economy, and EU membership would be the best way to get it. That was, and it still is, in our strategic interest, but that is also in the interest of the Europeans. All those fears and doubts which existed before about Ukraine's membership in the EU, because of the size of Ukrainian economy, because of its being so poor and so many problems and so on and so forth, they are still here, they are not gone. But the situation overall has changed in such a way that even with all those problems, it is better, in my view, for Europe to accept Ukraine as an EU member.
I get that, and I understand where you're coming from with that. However, it does pose a question for me in that if Ukraine were to become economically tied to the European Union, a member of the European Union, and you know all the economic ties that comes with that, there are going to have to be security guarantees. Because push comes to shove, if the economies are tied together and Ukraine is drawn into another war with Russia, so maybe not NATO and Article 5, but these other ideas of an Article 5-like security guarantee from the Europeans has been floated. I wonder, I hear your advocacy for EU membership, but there's going to have to be security guarantees as well.
Absolutely.
Where are your thoughts on that?
Another complicated issue of security guarantees. No easy questions for Ukraine.
Yeah, this is Ukraine. I challenge you to find me an easy question to ask with an easy answer.
Actually,
aside from sovereignty.
There are security provisions in the Lisbon Treaty, which are not weaker than the formulations of the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. That means that if Ukraine joins the EU, it formally gets some security guarantees, which promise assistance from other EU members in case Ukraine is attacked. We don't know whether those promises will be kept. Just like we don't know what happens if Ukraine joins NATO and is attacked by Russia. That's why I said that the security guarantees issue is difficult, because even Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which is being raised by most of Ukrainian experts as the best possible solution to Ukraine's security problems, does not provide an automatic 100% guarantee. It stipulates that the countries should come and help the one which is being attacked with all the measures they consider necessary. And they consider what they consider necessary can vary in very significantly. The problem is, I do doubt that the NATO member countries would risk the war with Russia to protect Ukraine, and because of that, Russia can expect them not to be so resolute in protecting Ukraine, and that is the strategic problem for NATO. If they invite a country to be a member and are not ready to protect it, that would significantly weaken the whole alliance. That's why they did not accept Ukraine. Not only did not accept Ukraine as a NATO member, but didn't even give the Bucharest summit.
The Bucharest Agreement.
In the Bucharest, the
in
decision
94.
of Bucharest up in 2008. The Bucharest summit of NATO, which didn't provide Ukraine and Georgia with
not the Budapest Agreement, the Bucharest summit of 2008.
Right.
Okay, right.
They have been very hesitant in dealing with Ukraine, even before the Russian-Ukrainian war, because they did understand the risks and wanted to avoid them. That's absolutely understandable. So the problem is that the Article 5 would not provide a 100% guarantee for Ukraine, unfortunately. Any formalized security agreement, defense pact, which is usually understood classically as a security guarantee, will not work automatically. I've recently looked through the statistics of how different sorts of security guarantees arrangements have been working in recent 2 centuries. And the statistics is quite telling. That is, in most cases, they have been violated. I mean, defense pacts have not been observed in more than 60% of cases. The best statistics of 70+%, I guess, is for neutrality pacts and for aggression pacts, as far as I remember. What the point is that if states promise anything to other states concerning their defense, they do not necessarily fulfill those promises. And that is the usual, normal practice of international politics, unfortunately. That means that whatever formal security guarantees Ukraine can get, including NATO membership, bilateral defense pacts, or EU membership, they will not serve as 100% protection. Moreover, the conditions are very bad for Ukraine to find allies. Countries are not willing to become Ukraine's allies for a variety of reasons, out of fear mostly, but that is quite understandable. So most likely Ukraine will have to proceed without allies, and that means that Ukraine will have to rely on its own forces, which means that we cannot accept any limitations on our armed forces. We cannot accept limitations on our cooperation, security cooperation with our partners, and we will need to pump huge amounts of money into defense after the war. That would be the basis of Ukraine's security. Probably one might call it security guarantee.
Yeah, we have been skirting around one central problem in negotiations, and to my mind, and that is, you have expressed 3 points there already in our conversation, which you think Ukraine will need in a settlement agreement, and that is the ability to pursue membership in the European Union. You've spoken about the need for no limitations on weaponry, and the third one there that will be needed, some kind of security guarantee. So we've spoken about things that Ukraine needs, but oftentimes it seems that this conversation, especially in the international community, is asking more of what Ukraine needs to do, what Ukraine needs to surrender or give up or compromise upon. But very little conversation is made of what Moscow needs to compromise on or surrender on, certainly in the on the international stage. As a Ukrainian, aside from your area of expertise, what do you think about all that? That there's so much more talk about what Ukraine needs to do and very little talk about what Russia needs to do.
I will start from a somewhat distant perspective. When the full-scale invasion erupted, that came as a surprise for me, because as a realist, my assessment was that such a decision would go too far for the Russians, and it would be too risky. And from the point of view of the cost-benefits analysis, it will be a bad decision. But when it has been taken and when Ukraine has been attacked in February of 2022, my initial publication was that Russia is about to lose this war. Meaning that for me, losing or winning the war is getting either a better or a worse world afterwards. So my idea was not that Russia will necessarily lose on a bilateral level, that will be defeated by Ukraine. But my point was that Russia will lose strategically. Even if it manages to occupy additional Ukrainian territories and keep them, it will get a significantly weakened position globally compared to what was before 2022. And in my view, so far I think that assessment has been correct. Russia is likely to keep parts of territories of Ukraine occupied for an indefinite period of time. Whether they will be accepted in some sort of a formal agreement, de facto accepted by a number of Western countries or some specific countries, or just it will be a de facto occupation like it was with the Crimea before 2022, Russia will retain them. But the price of doing that will be very high. It will make Russia vulnerable in many ways. It will make Russia dependent on other great powers, and generally will make Russia's voice in the world less respected and less powerful. So that was my idea. And what I do understand why the people in different countries are saying that Ukraine should give up something, because from their perspective, Ukraine is losing the war, and this is it seems to be logical that if a country is losing the war, it has to make some concessions to put the war to an end. But the problem for Russia is that Russia is Ukraine might be losing, but Russia is not necessarily winning.
Yeah. Paying a high price for it.
The price Russia is paying is very high. And as I have already mentioned, this is an asymmetric war, which is judged not by the standards of the World War II, for instance. If you can have a look at the map where front lines are moving, or where you can capture the capital of your opponent and make him sign a surrender. In asymmetric modern war situation is quite different. And even by gaining territorial advantages, you might end losing the war in the end. So that means that talking about Russia's concessions is also important and necessary. This is not like by occupying parts of Ukrainian territory, Russia can demand whatever it wants. There is nothing on the battlefield which enables Russia to take such a position and to make no concessions. Because of that, within that logic, I think Russians should accept some very unpleasant facts for them that Ukraine will remain as an independent, functional, and strong state capable of defending itself. And almost surely that state would be anti-Russian. There can be a variety of degrees about how exactly those anti-Russian sentiments could be translated into policies, and whether Ukraine, for instance, should be looking for ways to regain occupied territories, make it an official goal of its foreign and security policy or not, how to treat possible NATO membership, how deep its cooperation with the West should be, and then on which level. So there are different ways of being anti-Russian. But that militarily strong, efficient, and independent state would be present on the Russian borders.
Mm-hmm.
If the Russians accept that fact, that probably will push them towards reformulating what they want. It will probably make them think what kind of a neighbor they would like to have, and whether they are ready to make certain steps to improve somehow in the future relations with Ukraine. These moves might seem technical in the beginning. For instance, in my view, when the provisional framework for a negotiated settlement has been discussed back in spring, for me it was an important element that Russians return control over Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It might seem a technical nuance, but it is important for Ukraine for a variety of reasons. They could have done that, but they refused. And that was an indication of a lost opportunity, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
Territorial issues are extremely difficult. And because of that, if there is a territorial dispute within a conflict, it is very difficult to resolve, as we might see from a variety of such situations all over the world in recent decades. Can Russians better understand Ukraine's needs, concerns, and desires, and make some steps towards Ukraine's needs? That is a rhetorical question. I see that they are not ready to do that.
No, well, they don't see Ukraine as sovereign, so
that's the key problem. But they will have to sooner or later.
Eventually, yes.
And if they do, then the whole range of issues which are on the agenda will be approached very differently. In my view, Putin should have accepted the deal which Trump has been offering to him back in April, that is freezing along the front line. That is the basis of the territorial dispute. But he refused. And that was that was also another risky decision by Putin, unjustified in my view.
Yeah. Well, it's a discussion for another day, but I think Putin is caught between, he's in what we call a catch-22. There's no good solution for him. But you bring up the idea of asymmetrical warfare that the Russians conduct. And by asymmetrical warfare, from what I've seen from my years of covering Russia, is not simply information warfare, and that is to say propaganda or influence campaigns, but there's also very real espionage and covert activities, finding useful idiots and compromising people to get them to do Moscow's bidding. How concerned are you about, we see it even in America where Moscow's narratives clearly are finding traction within Trump's America. We see it all throughout Europe with Moscow supporting far-right political groups to sow dissent. We see it even on the state level with proxies in Belarus or Orban being, very, very close and also a spoiler within Europe. How concerned are you? I don't think it's going to happen here in Kyiv, because Ukrainians are very aware of this. And as you say, Ukrainians are going to be resentful and angry and have ill will and ill emotions towards Russia for a very long time. But how concerned are you when it comes to Russia's influence using their hybrid war to diminish support for Ukraine?
I don't see they have too many chances for success. If they failed in that kind of...
Orban, for example, being a spoiler within the EU.
Yeah, I know the examples. And what I mean is that if Russians failed generally with that strategy before 2022, they probably will have no chances to reach anything with that after the war. On the other hand, there are realistic Russians. Well, I know some of them personally, who before 2022 they have been saying that the Kremlin, in its strategic approach to Ukraine, has abandoned the idea of finding another Yanukovych or installing a pro-Russian government because of a realistic assessment of what is happening of public opinion in Ukraine, which has been made very anti-Russian by the annexation of Crimea and what was happening in Donbass afterwards. And many Russians back then already have been quite realistic in accepting that it will be impossible to bring Ukraine back into the Russia sphere of influence by utilizing those tools you have been mentioning. And thus, if that would have been impossible, they proceeded, those realistic Russians, that the major goal of Russia in dealing with Ukraine should not be so much getting Ukraine back into its sphere of influence, into the Russian world and so on and so forth, but to make Ukraine as weak as possible. Understanding that Ukraine is inevitably going to become a part of anti-Russian something, look for opportunities to join any anti-Russian initiatives and generally pursue a very anti-Russian policy, Russia should make Ukraine weak. In a realistic Russian understanding of what makes a state strong or weak, material capabilities, resources, that is territory, economy, and people. Make Ukraine less territorially, make its economy destroyed, and make Ukrainians leave Ukraine would be the best possible strategy for Russia in dealing with Ukraine. And what we have been witnessing afterwards, including the invasion itself and the way the war has been handled, for me is a demonstration of how that kind of strategy is working. It is putting a very heavy emphasis not so much on usual hybrid tactics of infiltrating into Ukrainian informational, political, and whatever space, but just by implying very rude hard power to physically diminish Ukrainian potential.
Yeah. I want to ask you one last question before we start to wind down here. And it's a little off the beaten path of what we've already spoken about, but I think it's important. What do you think is the importance of Ukraine's relationship with the so-called global South? So, again, we've spoken about the power structures, America, European Union, Moscow, but there's been a lot of talk about trying to get the global South on board with Ukraine, not least of which because maybe votes in the UN or, diminishing Russian influence in the global South. What are your thoughts about Ukrainian relationships with the global South?
They have been underestimated for a long period of time, and when Ukrainian government started to pay attention to improving relations with the global South, it has been too late already, unfortunately. That's what generally I have a very broad understanding of how mistaken Ukrainian strategic thinking was for quite a while. I mean that it lost touch with reality. In a sense that Ukrainian decision makers, politicians, diplomats, and a huge share of experts continued to believe they live in the world of 1990s, in which the West is powerful. There is no global south, there is just a very weak China. When NATO is expanding and protecting everything around it, when EU is a dream to come true with no problems and a bright future. But unfortunately, those things started to change when democracy is expanding, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, those things started to change dramatically in the first decade of the 21st century, especially. The weakness of Russia, another feature of those 1990s, which seemed to be to last forever.
Yep.
But already in the first decade of the 21st century, there was a democracy in retreat globally. There was a global financial crisis which led to a huge redistribution of wealth globally. There was a revisionist Russia with a completely new foreign policy agenda. There were significant changes in Ukraine neighborhood. There was hesitation about the future of the EU, the credibility and reliability of NATO, and those changes have not been noticed by Ukrainian leaderships to a huge extent. And they continued to build their foreign policy strategy, to put forward foreign policy goals and priorities, just as they have continued to live in 1990s. One of those illusions was linked to Global South. It has been underestimated. I mean, it has become evident that given the dynamics, China would replace the United States as world #1 economy, that it would consolidate the political links with other countries, and then very soon Global South will emerge as a very powerful pole in a new system, and that would bring about a new bipolarity, how I perceive modern international politics, is a bipolar system which is even more bipolar than it used to be during the Cold War, with much closer gap between China and the US than it was between the USSR and the US. And as a result, Ukraine found itself heavily dependent on the West, and there is no practical opportunity to develop meaningful political dialogue with the key players from the Global South. It would have been very, I think, useful for Ukraine to find the ways for dialogue with China, because China's position is extremely important in the war. But even apart from that, beyond the issues of war, it is important for Ukraine. Ukraine actually, if you have a look at Ukrainian economy, this is a Global South country, mostly agricultural, depending or linked with developing countries' markets to a great extent, but certainly due to geography also, trading with the European Union. Many countries with the type of economy like Ukraine have demonstrated, well, pretty mixed, but sometimes quite successive results in integrating with China's One Belt, One Road, and generally into building closer ties with China. Certainly they didn't have political conditions like Ukraine has, security conditions. China is our trade partner #1. However, the United States used to be our security partner #1. For Ukraine, it creates a huge strategic dilemma given the worsening relations between the United States and China. But we have never properly addressed those issues. We have been very, I would say, reactive to what was happening on the global level of international politics. And because of that, we We just don't have enough substance to talk about in a dialogue with China, with India, with Brazil, or with the countries of Africa. There is a symbolic shift. We can build more embassies. We can send more delegations.
Mm-hmm.
We can arrange more round tables. We can, not during the war, but we can exchange more people. But at the same time, the limitations are too heavy on Ukraine's foreign policy. And the war is making us less free in our dialogue with the rest of the world. And because of that, I believe that this dimension of Ukraine's foreign policy, a very important one, it will be unfortunately remaining somewhat within a very narrow framework.
We've talked so much about all the different kind of aspects of Ukraine's relationships with all of these different power dynamics, with different power brokers, big and small, around the world. And so it does lead me to the question of how consequential do you think the outcome of this conflict will be in terms of that shifting dynamic that is happening globally? How important is the resolution of this war to the future of whether it's Europe or transatlantic or even global, depending on how big you want to take it?
That's the issue I've already discussed with my students, and even have published a couple of pieces on that. That is how the war is affecting international order. There has been a widespread belief among Ukrainians that this war is the core issue, is very important for the future of the world. And that is understandable because these people are being affected by the war. They live here and they tend to overestimate the significance of what is happening for the history generally. So in a sense, I tend to limit that impact. I tend to place this unique war in many ways, not looking like the rest of the wars in recent decades. But nevertheless, I tend to place it as one of the huge regional militarized conflicts which the world has experienced in one way or another, in one form or another. And in that sense, the Russian-Ukrainian war is standing in line with a number of other conflicts. Some of them are less violent, some of them are less geographically expanded, but they are still important. We are living in the period of the so-called power transition, when the reigning hegemon is declining and the competing powers are coming instead.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, mostly this is between the United States and China, and when this is happening on the global level, there is a power transition theory developed by Argansky and Kugler back in 1950s, saying that when something like this is happening, it triggers regional instability. In that sense, what we are experiencing in the Russian-Ukrainian war is a symptom of global power shifts, just like a number of other regional conflicts. But on the other hand, there is an additional importance in this war, because this is one of the very few interstate wars in current history,
mm-hmm.
and this is happening in a very sensitive region.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the fact that it is happening in Europe changes a lot because it is affecting simultaneously several great powers in the modern world. Not only Russia, but also Europe itself, major European countries, the interests of the United States, and even China, no matter how distant it is. And because of that, all those great powers are having bets in this conflict, and they would not like to lose those bets. Some of them cannot afford Russia losing, some of them cannot afford Ukraine losing, and that gives Ukraine a chance of utilizing those interests and desires into political and military support, turning them into political and military support, that also tends to make the war last longer, in my view. But it also makes it fundamental. The resolution of this war will be really important for how the future international order arrangements will be made.
Yeah, I agree. Just two last questions. I mean, there and domestically, internally within Ukraine, and I know there's so many variables to this because how this war ends is still very much in question. But at the basic presumption that there is a sovereign Ukraine at the end of this conflict, where do you see its place within the structure of Europe and even globally? What is this country called Ukraine going to mean after the war?
As I've said, I strongly believe and hope that Ukraine will end up as the EU member, which will be a basic framework for its political development and for its general geopolitical place. That would help not only to sustain Ukraine economically, but also to make it democratic. Ukraine has, for a very few moments in its history, been a democratic state, and the war is negatively affecting democratic institutions. And I think it is a huge task for Ukraine to sustain democracy. And being a member of Europe and European Union institutions is important. I don't believe that Ukraine will be a NATO member. So I can technically or formally compare Ukraine's status to that of Finland. The issue of Finlandization, which has been so much debated here in Ukraine before the invasion, criticized, negatively taken the experience of Finland, which had to limit its foreign and security policy, take into consideration the Soviet Union's concerns, and become a neutral de facto country in exchange for more freedom and economic development and the right to become a part of the West, without consisting a military threat to the Soviet Union. I do know the weaknesses of historical parallels, and when I'm saying Finlandization concerning Ukraine, I don't mean technically reproducing the experience of Finland, but probably something close to that, politically, culturally, a part of the West. On a military and security level, a network of negotiated settlements with the Russians, the format of bilateral coexistence, which would, I hope, leave Ukraine open to a variety of opportunities in an evolving battle or competition between the West and the global South, meaning not to become a weapon of the West against China and global South, but having an opportunity to build strong economic ties with multiple partners, including the countries of the global South.
And just the last question I have for you is how far or distant do you think the possibility of a negotiated peace exists? Or unfortunately, does this have to be ultimately resolved on the battlefield? I mean, obviously, everybody comes to you sit down on a table, you make peace across the table with your enemy, not with your friend. But are we anywhere closer to a negotiated peace, or is it much farther off, or God forbid, does it just mean killing and more blood?
My assessment during the whole period of war has been that there is roughly 5% chance of reaching a negotiated settlement in a 1-year perspective. When Trump came to power and started to push his mediation efforts, and especially in April of this year, my assessment jumped to about 40%. Back in April, I believe that there is a 40% chance of having a peace agreement by the end of the year. Now I'm back to about 10% probability that before the end of 2026 there will be any negotiated settlement. There are a variety of reasons behind it, and as I have said, it's much more difficult in the modern world to put the wars to an end than to launch them. These factors which have been playing against any negotiated settlement before today, they are still in play. There is a global disruption, in the international system, and great powers competing among themselves. There is absence of the zone of possible agreement in bilateral relations of Ukraine and Russia. There is the best alternative to negotiate agreement is perceived by both countries as quite acceptable, which is also not good for negotiations. And there is a very high political price for concessions for both countries, which makes perspectives of peace settlement very unlikely.
Sadly, I'm afraid you're right. And as we bury, at the time of recording, 22 civilians who were killed by Russian missiles this week alone, sadly, I don't think that kind of death toll is going to stop anytime soon. Mykola, I appreciate you having come and spoken to us today. It was a very thoughtful conversation, and I hope that my audience finds it of use to them, your input and your expertise and your considered arguments there and positions are very much appreciated. So thank you for coming and visiting.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Philip.